Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about our one and only sponsor or advertiser. It's the Great Courses Plus. It's an app on your phone. Looks like this. For those of you watching, you just touch the app. It opens it up. And the access to hundreds of courses and therefore thousands of lectures is available for a monthly fee if you subscribe through my podcast. That is, you go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. You get a free trial. And therefore you have free access to hundreds of courses and therefore thousands of lectures. Just to give you an idea, instead of focusing on one particular course that I've been listening to, just to give you a little bit of a sampling, great ideas of psychology, philosophy and physics, the dark side of human nature, the pagan world, the Pacific Theater in World War II, white-collar criminal law, U.S. government, mind-blowing science, this day in history, September, recording this in September 2020, Apollo 11, everyday guide to beer, everyday guide to beer, Battlefield Europe, infectious diseases, a field guide to the planets, the science of extreme weather, what we know about the Big Bang, and on and on and on. Literally, just hundreds. You just scroll through. And the beauty about this app, thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon, is that instead of purchasing a single course and then feeling like you need to listen to all the lectures, maybe you don't want to listen to all the lectures. Maybe you just want to do a sampling, which is pretty much what I usually do. So give it a try. It's, again, you go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. Thanks for listening. My special guest today that does not have a new hardback edition of a book out is Douglas Murray. Actually, he's in the States doing some promotion for the paperback edition of The Madness of Crowds. But mainly he's here to cover journalistically our upcoming election and all the craziness that's been going on for 2020. And so we talked about basically what's happened since The Madness of Crowds came out a year ago. Kind of updates on race and gender and gay issues and trans issues and the so-called cancel culture, and to what extent is it real? How extensive is it? What you can do to push back if you're not really a racist or a bigot and you're being called that? The emphasis and push for corporations to put their employees through racial sensitivity training programs and the Trump administration's pushback against that. And basically all the kind of craziness that's been going on in 2020 and what he thinks as a British journalist observing American culture might happen in the coming months and even really in the coming years. Is this much ado about nothing, or is this a true turning point in Western or U.S. Culture? So we'll see. And with that, I give you Douglas Murray, one of the most interesting, thoughtful people writing today. So you're in LA doing some book touring for the paperback edition of The Madness of Crowds?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I'm in America all month, just sort of right ahead of the election and all that. So
oh, right. You're
a great time to be
You're probably
here.
covering that for your journalistic career,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly. There's no shortage of material, as you know.
It's gotten pretty crazy. Well, I had you on here a year ago when The Madness of Crowds first came out, and I'm so pleased that the book did so well that we're no longer having to talk about race or gender anymore. The conversation ended.
You must say
and
that.
We've moved on to other topics.
Haven't we just? Oh,
that's too funny. I just had Shelby Steele on the podcast, and he wrote this book 30 years ago, The Content of Our Character, in which he then was complaining about America's obsession with talking about race. And so I opened with the same line. It's like, well, 30 years ago, you wrote this book, and thank God we've moved beyond race. It just doesn't seem. We writers like to think we make a difference with our ideas, but sometimes these things have a life of their own.
Exactly. Oh,
and yet,
Anyhow.
you were not canceled. So you, I'll just read the opening paragraph of your Afterword, the new Afterword for the paperback edition of Madness of Crowds. Culture wars, like all wars, can simmer down and flare up again in the space of days. When The Madness of Crowds was published in September 2019, I expected immediate excommunication from whatever polite society still existed. Yet, the rebukes did not come. As with the book's predecessor, The Strange Death of Europe, I had trodden across some of the biggest landmine issues of our time, only to find myself still here. And here you are. You managed to get to America, no problem, and you weren't canceled in the UK. And so I do wonder, the cancel culture and all that stuff. We all talk about it. It looks bad, and yet you're still doing fine. I'm still doing fine. Lots of people that push back seem to be surviving okay. So I do wonder maybe if you think we've turned the corner.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I wonder whether, among other things, the inflection point we might be at needs a sort of new thing to be stressed in it, which is that we have, I think, for some years, those of us who've been outspoken and who've been slightly against the prevailing trends of the time, have tended to think of ourselves as a sort of embattled species. And there's good reason to feel that, isn't there? I mean, we all know that we can all point to colleagues and friends who have really been embattled because of nothing other than saying things that are true. And yet I wonder increasingly whether there isn't something self-defeating in this, in that, who would want to join a losing side?
Right.
Who would want to join a side where they thought there was no future? And I increasingly, and I'm not saying this merely as a sort of PR gloss or something, I honestly think that there is something changing. And that whereas it used to be the case that there was only a disproportionate risk to speaking out on certain very tricky issues of our time, perhaps we're getting to a point where actually there's a reward mechanism for it as well. That is, that as I've discovered, as you've discovered, that there are many people who don't want to be locked in the endlessly retributive and unprepossessing, ugly conflicts that they're being invited to involve themselves in throughout their lives, that there's actually advantages to not going along with the crowd,
right.
That there is a benefit to not going along with it. Now, maybe the number of people we can point to are relatively small in number who vindicate that idea at the moment. But I think that contraflow is growing. And I think it's going to grow in the months and years ahead, because increasingly the things that people like you and me have written about, spoken about in recent years, are things that everybody else in their day-to-day life are coming across. When we last spoke last year, there was still a lot of people in business who had never come across critical race theory.
Right.
That stuff just hadn't landed at their doorstep. The flotsam and jetsam of that thought movement hadn't washed up on their shore.
Right.
A year later, it has done on far more people's doorsteps, on far more shores. And so more and more people are in the position of having to address these questions. And I think that as a result, more and more people are going to address them in a way which is counter to the way that they are being instructed is the only way to address them.
Are you talking about like the sensitivity training programs that corporations are falling over themselves to say we're going to put all our employees through? Yeah, in a way, it's kind of a way of these corporations. They're trying to get virtue signaling credit. And yet, by doing so, they're kind of saying, well, yeah, we're a bunch of racists here, and we've employed racist policy, and we're going to try to overcome that.
Yeah.
A little bit like that Princeton University letter that they issued a few weeks ago that the Trump administration called them out on, in which they said, we're going to combat our own racism. We've been terribly racist, to which the Trump administration said, oh, yeah, we've been giving you federal money, and if you've been in violation of the law of Title IX, then we need to know about it. And they're like, oh, well, no, we don't. We mean systemic racism. Yeah, well, what does that mean? Systemic racism. You mean you personally are racist? Well, not me. No, not me. You mean the guy next to you? No, not him. Not any one of our employees. Just systemically, whatever that means.
Yes. That was a beautiful move by the administration, I have to say. It was like a bluff calling, but it was more severe in a way, wasn't it? Because it showed that Princeton wasn't just sort of bluffing; it was doing something even uglier. I'm so glad that they were called out on it. I think there might be a bit more of that. I mean, after all, there's also been this trend since we last spoke of employers telling their employees which books to read. Right. In my own country, the United Kingdom, there were government agencies, government departments where bosses were telling the employees, you should read the following book. You must read the following books. So all of this has clearly come to a lot more people and is going to be troubling a lot more people. And as a result, those of us who have been saying, this will come to you, watch out, are being vindicated. And those of us who have been thinking about this for some time are at something of an advantage because we can explain to other people, look, these are the moves you're going to have to make to counter the moves that are being made against you. And it's necessary not to win any cultural war, but just to return to something like normality where, different racial groups aren't played against each other and women and men aren't played against each other and straights and gays aren't played against each other. And I think this is all eminently winnable because I think there's a preposterous overreach by the wokerati.
Yes, the rogue. Are you talking about books that are being recommended like anti racism and white fragility and some of those that are on the New York Times bestseller list? Yeah, it's interesting.
Absolutely. The unreadable books.
They're just awful. I do wonder if there is really such a thing as white guilt, or if we're just supposed to have white guilt. We wonder why we don't have it. And then we try to signal like, yes, I feel really guilty about this, even though I don't really feel guilty about it because I didn't do anything and I'm not a racist. But I know I'm supposed to signal that I do feel this way. So you get this kind of meta conversation going above the reality.
Yes, that's right. There are so many strange things going on in this. One of them is that. One of them, I quite agree with what you say, by the way, about Princeton being a very good example. But the weird way in which people make themselves sound guilty when they do the thing that's being demanded of them. I think of, for instance, the post George Floyd celebrity video where all of these white actors and actresses, including Aaron Paul from Breaking Bad, and I think Julianne Moore, who I was sorry to see in it because I think she's a wonderful actress, all do this video where they say, I take responsibility. Yeah. And, any ordinary person watches this and thinks, what did you do to George Floyd? Julianne Moore, were you involved in this sort of stuff? Did you do this to anyone? And because that's the response it should be. When an institution says we're reevaluating everything because we think we're racist, the natural instinct that most of us should have is to say, what were you doing until yesterday? Because the rest of us weren't. The rest of us weren't killing anyone. We weren't oppressing anyone. We weren't enslaving anyone. We were getting on with our lives and allowing other people to get on with theirs. And most of us didn't have any deep, vicious racism. Most of us don't have a racist bone in our bodies. And so when these celebrities and corporations and others say sorry for what we're doing, it should be a flag. It should be a warning sign to everyone else. And it should beg a lot of questions.
Yeah. I had this conversation with a lefty physicist friend of mine at a major California university. He was going on and on about the misogyny and the discrimination against women in physics and math. And, we need to hire more professors, female professors, because, we're discriminating against them. To which I said, you mean you personally? Because you work at one of these universities. You personally don't hire women because you don't like them? Well, no, of course not. I said, and your colleague, that guy there, this one? No, they're not. We're trying to hire more women. It's like, okay, well, who's doing this? And, again, it's this, there's no names to name. It's just this kind of systemic, it's built into the system. Yeah, but where exactly is the problem so we can address it? When in fact, that's not a problem. They're trying to, every university is falling over themselves to hire more women in math and physics.
Absolutely. This is one of the ways that our age evades things. I've noticed it in other contexts as well, We had it in the UK. I think we've had it in Europe in relation to terrorism, where a really specific person will do an act of terrorism, say, and the government will say things like, we've all got to work out where we have responsibility for stopping this, and you just think, but I'm not sure most of us can do anything. I mean, if you heard that somebody was going to let off a bomb, you'd sure as hell tell the police. But I'm not sure most of us do have any responsibility for that. And I started to notice it in that. I thought there's something off in this, because once you try to disperse responsibility that widely, it means you can't actually have accountability anywhere. Right. And I think we're on the same level, as you say, with your friend, colleague on that, is that, all of these things like, racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia have become these amorphously, widely dispersed things, which people now find understandably great difficulty actually pinpointing.
Yeah.
And I do think it's therefore it becomes about something else. It's not about countering racism. It's about, getting through the era survivably, something like that, being thought of well by your peers by reciting the new credo.
Right. I think that's what it is. There's a lot of virtue signaling. I know I'm supposed to say X, even though I don't really believe that that's a problem for me. Yeah. So, this slate of new books that are popular, I suspect a lot of people are reading them because they feel like they're supposed to read them and absorb it or something like that. If you look at the data of polls that ask questions like, if a black family moved into your neighborhood, would you move out? I mean, it used to be the majority of Americans said, yes, I would move out. But, by the 1980s or so, those numbers plummeted. And now they don't even ask those questions anymore. So as I like to say, conservatives today are more liberal than liberals were in the 1950s in terms of socially. And questions like that just don't get out. Interracial marriage. Do you think that's okay? Until 1967, interracial marriage was illegal in a lot of states until the Supreme Court made it the law of the land. You can't discriminate marriage based on race. And now no one even asks that question anymore. And I predicted after 2015 Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage that this conversation would just drop. That religious conservatives who, until 2011, the majority were against same-sex marriage. By 2015, it was starting to go the other direction. And after the Supreme Court decision, the polls started to really slide in the good direction. But again, I think this will be a non-conversation within a few years, even amongst religious conservatives. And yet, when you hear activists, you would think America is the most racist, misogynist, bigoted country ever, as if, and so here's one of my rebuttals to these people. You mean you're saying that the work of Martin Luther King Jr. and his colleagues in the civil rights movement had no effect at all? They did nothing. It was a complete waste of time? It's like, well, no, of course not. No, they did great things. Well, then what are we talking about?
Yes. This is what one can think of as the Great Oppression deficit. There's not enough oppression going on in the era for the amount of oppression that's desired or needed to fuel the outrage. I'm like you. I'm not by any means sanguine about the fact that inequalities and unfairnesses and unpleasantness occurs in society. I think some of it you can deal with, some of it's almost certainly ineradicable.
Yeah.
But the idea that, you shout as loud as people are shouting today in the situation in which they find themselves today is perverse. And I do think it needs to be called out. I think the reason it isn't called out more is probably just that there's very little negative feedback currently if you just go along with saying these things. Very few people will actually call you out on it, will call your bluff, will point out you're being kind of hypocritical, or just say you're being hysterical, which is what it is. I mean, much of it has been the adoption of a hysterical attitude about our society. And I suppose people don't particularly like to point that out. They probably fear that if they say people are hysterical, they'll be criticized for that next as well. But these are this is what is happening. There's a almost you might also say a catastrophic view of society that's been adopted, particularly in America, because of course so much of this is an American cultural issue that has been spilling out globally, mainly to English-speaking countries, with incredibly negative effects for everyone.
Yeah, so many of these things seem to turn on a misinterpretation of the facts. So, for example, in the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, it's sort of described as if, he was a young black man just innocently walking down the street. Cop pulls over, tells him to put up his hands. He puts up his hands, and he's shot in cold blood, like he was a Nazi at the pit lining up Jews and shooting them into the pit. And of course, that's not at all what happened. But people that believe that's what happened, of course, they're outraged. And even the George Floyd case, the LA Times had a story a few weeks ago about what his lawyer might argue, the lawyer for Derek Chauvin, the cop. And that, first of all, the hold that he put on him, the knee on the neck, turns out that's the policy of the police department he works in. That's what he's supposed to do. So if you're trained to do that, and these are the circumstances in which you do it, which is what the training calls for, then how do you convict somebody for that? Or that George Floyd was calling out, "I can't breathe," even when he was sitting on the curb and no one was touching him because he was having an anxiety attack or something like that. So these are the kinds of things. He's going to get a defense. His trial will be probably next spring. And because they bumped it up to second-degree murder, that the prosecution has to prove that Derek Chauvin intended to kill him. That's much harder to do.
Intended to kill him, exactly. Which is a much harder. And then you do face this issue of, might he get off?
He might. And I wouldn't go anywhere near a downtown big city if that happens.
By the way, all of this is a reminder. I quite agree. I think that that's a really catastrophic scenario. But all of this points this issue, which as writers we know, which is that you have to be so careful always to make sure you don't embed a tiny lie in case the tiny lie grows. Now, if it were the case, for instance, that the society was so completely wedded to the idea that the cop who's been charged, it has to be guilty, then you don't allow for the possibility he could get off. You don't allow for the possibility of a fair trial. And you don't know how your society would cope if the verdict went one of the only two ways it can go. And that's a big problem. It's the same thing with, as you say, with the Ferguson shooting. This is a disastrous thing because a false version of what happened was just pumped around, immediately racialized, and as a result, and this is, I think, for all of us, a big question we still have to deal with. We face a situation where there are people who believe that what happened was worse and was even more, or was more racially motivated than it was. And that's why you get these people who fight like hell, thinking that they live in a racialist society. And I don't know about you, I find this one a deep conundrum, because it's all very well to sort of disagree with somebody else's views, but when you're disagreeing with somebody else's reality, and their reality has been constructed by a set of claims which have been proven not to be true, but which they have held on to as true as they've gone along, by now they do have a sincere belief about the nature of society, right, which is very hard to counter because they have their own history of it.
Yeah, it's like that Washington Post study on the 1,000 people that were shot by cops. 26% were blacks, but blacks consist of 13% of the population. Therefore, racism. Yeah, but the percentage of blacks in the population is not the baseline measure. It's how many encounters that you have with cops in the some engagement that they're encountering you with for some reason, which is usually they pulled you over for some particular reason. The 13% baseline implies that cops are just driving around thinking, well, we got to get our quota of blacks this month or something like that. Of course, that's not at all the case. So, but even saying that is controversial because everybody wants the baseline to be the percentage of blacks in the population. So if Google doesn't have 13% black programmers, ergo racism. But again, that's a incorrect fact as your baseline. But if you if you insist on that being your measure of a systemic racist society or something like that, then we're going to be talking at cross purposes.
Yeah, and by the way, I mean, this is all one of the reasons why it's a very good era to be a writer or a thinker.
Yeah.
Because aren't there, these strange, deep underlying things which we haven't addressed. Some of them are logical problems. Some of them are perception problems. Some of them are moral problems. And they lie now underneath the discourse in the society. And I find it fascinating that so few people spend time addressing these underlying, the tectonic shifts that are happening. But they include that, inability to deal rationally with the statistics. And I mean, there's a whole range of these. I mean, the one that in a way has started to preoccupy me most is the attempt to enforce diversity in the workplace. And along the lines you referred to there, that every workplace must reflect accurately the racial breakdown of the nation or the demographic across other ways, is going to be something which is going to gnarl up every American institution and company for the rest of our lives unless we stop this. And it seems weirdly in an era that talks all the time about diversity that we can't actually cope with it very well. We're not very good at it because our attempts to address it end up with these strange enforcement mechanisms, right, which are themselves pretty much unquestioned. The one I always do if I want to clear a dinner table is to say, what exactly is the idea about the virtue of diversity? Identical diversity in every workplace, for instance. There's an argument for it in certain industries, but why is there an argument for it in every industry? Right. If you were, for instance, if you had a sociology department, I suppose, in a university, you should probably aim for it to be pretty diverse in every imaginable way if you want to address the diversity of sociological analysis. But it's not clear to me why your local butchers needs to be completely diverse. It's not clear to me why every board needs to be diverse. It's not clear to me why every creative industry needs to be diverse. It seems to me, for instance, that we're seeing some pretty visible examples of how useless diversity is in certain sectors. Look at how diverse comedy is becoming, comedy writing. And we're not living in a golden age of comedy. It seems to me whenever I see Saturday Night Live or anything like that, I think we're living in an absolutely devastatingly bleak era right. of comedy. The writing has never been less funny. Yeah. And maybe it's because all the studios and everything are so desperate to make sure that they've got the right quotas that they forgot to remember to bring the jokes along.
Or it's the wrong kind of diversity. It studies on diversity in committees, for example, for solving problems. It's a diversity of perspectives or viewpoints or ideas that you need the most. People just come up with new hypotheses to test. And, the kind of poll the audience, wisdom of crowds only works for simple problems. Complex problems, you need a kind of a diversity of people with lots of different, people spitballing ideas and then trying to test them. And, the amount of melanin you have in your skin or which gonad you have or which you prefer in your sexual partners is totally irrelevant. It's the ideas that matter for these kinds of things. And so that's why I like Jonathan Haidt's, the Heterodox Academy. Basically, we're reminding the Academy, if you're pushing for diversity, don't forget viewpoint diversity, because that's the key to it to a university is a viewpoint. A diversity of ideas is the most important thing.
Yeah, no, I'm a great admirer of what he's managed to achieve with the Heterodox Academy. And of course, I'm sitting in a state at the moment here in California where all of this is going to be enforced into law on every single corporate board.
Right.
And as you know, the state of California vote, the legislation means that this year and next year it gets ramped up another gear. All boards need to have a certain quota of alleged, underrepresented people, which include Pacific Islanders, trans people, and others. And I joked to a friend recently, I mean, if you do the breakdown on the actual stats of how many members of these underrepresented groups there actually are in the state of California, they should clear their diaries for the rest of this decade because they're going to have to be dashing from board meeting to board meeting. And they are going to be in such demand. They should hope they don't have any other plans for this decade because...
Well, the other point Shelby makes, which he can make as a black guy that I can't, is that, by constantly talking about race and assessing everything by race, you're still kind of saying you can't do it without us whites. That is to say, we're going to lift you up, we're going to pull you up, and therefore you're still down and we're still up. And if you respond like he does, I don't need your help. Stop with the white guilt. We're done with that. We're going to make it on our own. You get pushback from white. So he tells this hilarious story speaking at the Aspen Institute, which is kind of a liberal version of TED. And he was the token conservative, and he got up and gave his speech about, to the sea of white people, you don't have to feel guilty. We're not worried about that anymore. We're past that. We've gotten, past, America's racist past and so on. Things are way better. So, chill out. Don't worry. And then afterwards, like a college-age, blonde-haired white guy got up to explain to Shelby Steele the reality of race in America. And he's like, dude, really? I've lived it. You have no idea what we used to go through. And I'm telling you, stop with the white guilt. We don't need it. But so Shelby's point is that he needed it, the young man. Like, I need this to exist, racism, sexism, and so on, to feel relevant. Like this is what I do. You need me. And when the oppressed group says, we don't need you, then what's the rescuers to do?
I come back to this point. I think one should be intensely suspicious of people playing that game. I mean, what a terrible story. I mean, it's a version of that thing that has been happening in the post-George Floyd riots, where we've seen this footage of, quite a lot of occasions where a sort of, white woman, or on one occasion I remember a white guy with his top off berating these black cops, screaming. I mean, I admire these policemen. When you see this, you think you have got nerves of steel. You have got the patience of a saint. I don't know how they do it, really. What I would say if I had this man or woman in my face, anyhow, it's a version of the same thing, isn't it? These people think they know better than other people what their lived reality is, and that they should explain it to them. And they see no oddity in this, and they see no embarrassment in it, it seems. But I do think that one of the things that has to happen now is that we do have to come out in being very suspicious of these people. I think these are people to whom great amounts of suspicion should be shown, like the boards and the institutions that talk about how racist they are. It's the same thing as the mechanism in the sort of post-Me Too era, where you absolutely knew, you could set your clock, that any man who went over the top about women, any man who went over the top about how oppressed women were and how much they suffer and how scummy men are, those people, make a note to yourself. You'll find a bit down the line that they are the worst, sexual molesters. They're the ones who do the nasty passes. They're the ones who actually look down on women. It's guaranteed. And I think we should expect this from the people who the white people who think that they know better than black people and lecture them and want white guilt. We should be suspicious of these people. They're doing something else. Right. And I think they're covering something else over. I think they have a genuinely guilty conscience.
Yeah,
and I think we should expose that.
I do too. When I hear that, I just say, speak for yourself. And are you speaking for yourself? You
Absolutely.
mean you personally? Yeah. And maybe that's the way to do it, just to to turn the tide, is to push back. You talked about J.K. Rowling in your new Afterword, because that whole thing happened after your book was initially published. And yet she's not canceled. I mean, people say, oh, they're canceling J.K. Rowling. How do you cancel a billionaire? I mean, she can do whatever she wants. I mean, but she just kind of stood up for herself. I think that was over the descriptor people who menstruate. You know, if only we had a word for who those people are.
Yeah. I so admire her, and I love the fact that as the weeks are going on, we get more and more people of influence, and and people with no voice at the moment, but will have a voice in the future, calling this stuff out. I think it's enormously refreshing, and I think it's particularly refreshing that somebody who is undoubtedly on the ideological left, on the political left, not the hard left, but the sort of center, soft left, like J.K. Rowling, has made a stand, and I think an enormous amount of credit should go to her and others who are willing to do that. And by the way, of course, the interesting thing is that the larger number of women have come forward in the last year, some of whom are by no means as famous as her, but they are fighting a really good fight here, and they're doing. They're not what their critics say they are. They are doing it, as J.K. Rowling did, with enormous decency and care and compassion and subtlety and and carefulness. Yeah. I know that people like to pretend, from the radical left, that J.K. Rowling is sort of, killing trans people or something, but she's so careful in what she says, and quite rightly so. And I just admire it, and I think that the people who go for her should really show themselves up, and may there be more of that.
And who was the other one? Margaret Atwood, I think. They went after her, and she survived. She pushed back, stood up, because she's not. She's not a bigot. Yeah.
No, I mean, and maybe in time, even some, people on the right may be forgiven for saying things that are true as well. I mean, I'm always loath to fall into that trap of sort of, only people on the left can be excused saying something that's correct. There is but they are very helpful when they do it, because you hope that it gives off the signal to other people on the left that they don't have to follow the most radical ideologues. I don't know if you saw there is a decent liberal centrist left.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw the story of Trader Joe's. Do you know Trader Joe's? The kind of a boutique supermarket in Southern California.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Anyway, they had these, sort of Trader Joe's this, Trader Joe's that, but for their Mexican food, they had like Trader Jose. And so, of course, the woke crazies went after them, and you must change that. You must take those labels off and relabel those products. And so they waited a few days, and then they issued a statement saying, well, we thought about what you said, and nope, we're leaving it just the way it is. And that was that,
That's right.
and they were not canceled. People didn't quit going to their stores. And I thought, maybe just standing up and go, nope, we're not going to do it. And at Chapman University, where
I think.
Go ahead.
No, sorry.
At Chapman University, where I teach, they have statues all over the campus, and there's champions like Albert Schweitzer, and civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King have a statue, but they also have Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman, and sort of these kind of Austrian economics libertarian types. So I don't know, a few months ago, students, okay, we have to take those down. Those statues have got to come down. So to his credit, the president issued a very thoughtful statement. Yes, I read your demands, your letter, and I thought a lot about it. And nope, we're leaving the statues up. And that was it. It's like, okay, all right.
That's what President Macron did in France. Nobody could present Macron as a sort of radical right winger or anything. But the moment that the statues wars kicked off in France, he made an announcement. He said, nothing is coming down. We're not pulling down any of our heritage in France. Forget about it. Nothing did come down. Nothing did come down. No, I mean, it's not because France is the most uniquely virtuous state in the world. It's just that he did the thing that any leader at such a point should do, which is particularly, of course, and this is in the corporate world so important, isn't it? As with Trader Joe's, is never get caught in that panicked hour or two,
right,
where it feels like the whole world is talking about you. Don't make decisions then. It should be like something taught in business school now. Don't act at the moment where it feels like, wrongly, but it feels like the whole world is talking about you and your product. Don't react. Wait, sleep on it. Give it a couple of days. The mob will move on, almost certainly. And you will, if you have reflected and thought, you'll come to a better decision. And probably you'll realize that there was nothing you needed to change, and that the whole thing has passed. Yeah. And that's a much better. And by the way, isn't it interesting again that if you do that, there was no ideological push in France really to pull down statues. But of course, if they had have got a couple down, there would have been such a thing as in America, and as started in my own country, the United Kingdom. The moment that the first statue was physically pulled down in Bristol of a man who was a philanthropist and also a slave trader in the 18th century, the moment that statue was physically pulled down and allowed by the police to be pulled down by the mob, that we entered the frenzy. The country felt in a frenzy because, the mayor of London started ordering certain statues to be removed from their plinths in London, and then set up a commission on the eradication of suspicious statues in the public space, sort of thing, and you could feel this was a mad frenzy to be in. None of this was stuff we didn't know about before. It was all stuff that was very interesting and could be addressed at length, but and in real depth. But as long as you don't join in the frenzy and at its height, you can come to reasonable decisions. It's not like every statue in the world has to remain where it is. But it's a terrible mistake to get into this thing of acting on the spur of the mob.
And as you put it, based on standards created last Tuesday.
I know it's so sad, this, because we've just had this in the UK with Lord Nelson, Admiral Nelson, died in 1805, and most famous for winning the Battle of Trafalgar. But today, because of the spillage of the American culture wars across the English-speaking world in particular, there's a serious push to bring down Nelson. The National Maritime Museum in Greenwich has said that they're reviewing his status as a historical figure in the light of the George Floyd killing. By the way, again, I mean, Admiral Nelson had nothing to do with policing in Minnesota in 2020. I mean,
right. So what is the connection there? He made some comments about blacks or something.
Interestingly enough, the claim made by his critics turns out to be completely false. There's a letter that they have used to claim that he was supporting the slave trade. And actually, it turns out the letter was forged after his death by people in favor of the slave trade, fighting against Wilberforce, who was, of course, opposed the slave trade. They forged the letter wanting to posthumously bring Napoleon onto their side and defend slavery. And now these are, very ill-educated critics of him 2 centuries later turn out to have just, and they all call, they're now saying, Nelson was a white supremacist. Nelson wouldn't have known what you were talking about if you talked about white supremacy. But all this stuff spills over. And of course, all it requires is a pause and some thoughtfulness and a recognition that, there will be things that Nelson did think, I think Nelson would have been rather surprised about gay marriage. I mean, it's true that he was a Navy man, so he wouldn't have been surprised about gays, but he would have been surprised. He would have been surprised about gay marriage and probably wouldn't have seen it coming. And if you'd asked him his views in 1804, he might have said that he wasn't entirely in favor of it. You could say, bring down Nelson. He also didn't. There definitely wasn't enough female representation in the Royal Navy in the 18th century. I think I think you could definitely get him
Yeah.
on that. He didn't have female quotas in the Royal Navy. But this route is madness, isn't it? I mean, it's madness to be doing this. We happen to have views in 2020. Other people had views in the past, and we can read about them and learn from them. But this thing of scouring through the past and eradicating it like this is such an unhealthy instinct for our society, and it clearly makes people dumber and more incurious and less educated and so much more.
There's a book that came out in the mid-90s that we covered in Skeptic called Black Athena. And its premise was that that the Greeks really got sort of Western philosophy and logic and so on from the Egyptians. And the Egyptians were black. And then there ensued this kind of conversation about what race were the Egyptians? And then Mary Lefkowitz, the classicist, wrote a beautiful book about this, basically saying the Egyptians and anyone in that time would not have even asked that question. That's such a late 20th century American question. What race are these people? And they would have said, "What the hell are you talking about?" It's a
yes, and isn't it? It's so sad as well. This I just so regret that at this stage in our history, this is what's clogging us up, because the fact that people in history didn't think in these terms, is also a reminder, isn't it, that ideas used to be transmittable across all boundaries. Right. I mean, the great figures of the past, the great schools of learning of the past, didn't block things, or the great ones didn't block things off for ideological reasons to do with skin pigmentation. I mean, it's not like the great scholars of Baghdad a millennium ago, if they came across a good idea, would say, we're not taking that idea. It came from somebody in the north.
Right.
Right. The great scholars of ancient Greece and Rome were great because of their willingness to imbibe ideas irrespective of the direction from which they came. And it seems something so self-hobbling in our own society that we wouldn't allow ourselves to do that. And that we want to do this reverse engineering in history and make sure our ideas are racially pure in some way. I mean, it's obscene, isn't it? There's an obscenity in it.
Yeah, I was binge watching that 10-hour series on Einstein that Nat Geo put on called Genius, and they did one on Pablo Picasso too. It's really, really brilliant. Anyway, during when Einstein became famous, there was a debate in the sort of Prussian Academy of Sciences about whether this was Jewish physics. And some of the more internationalists were going, "What are you talking about, Jewish physics? He's either right or he's wrong. That's the only thing that matters." And and then during the First World War, there was the British scientists were mostly against Einstein because he was overturning their champion Newton, and it was Eddington who ended up testing Einstein's general theory of relativity with the eclipse of the sun and the bending of the light. And all that, that's what made Einstein famous. And Eddington was something of an internationalist, not a nationalist. And he kept saying, I don't care what race or whatever he is, religion he is, he's either right or not. And even that was criticized. So this was like in 1920 when that kind of thing was going on. And then the guy that really hated Einstein, a guy named Leonard, ended up becoming the head of Nazi science. And it's like, oh, okay, because he was super anti-Semitic. And he was the one that was on about this Jewish science. So when the moment you enter into that equation into science or any kind of empirical or reason-based ideas, it's going to corrupt it.
Absolutely. It's just so reductive of our capacities and our capabilities as human beings that we would ever play that game. I wish more people knew this and knew the only route that will take them to, and that it is to a close. It is a lane that is closed. It It cannot get you anywhere.
It's the stuff like what you were...
And of course, it is the opposite of what has been the liberal mind.
Exactly.
It is the opposite of what the liberal mind was thought of as being, which was open.
That's right. It's not liberalism. It's illiberalism. And we've seen this with the Seattle and Portland protests, and of course Trump and the right are trying to portray everybody on the left is like that, and of course they're not. There's this confusion between real liberalism and progressivism or leftism or something like this. Anyway, Monday night I was doing a debate with Dinesh D'Souza, who's the sort of public intellectual of conservatism and so forth. Anyway, he's a pretty thoughtful guy, and so in the Q&A, we were to ask each other a question, and this was in a church, very conservative, religious. These were Lutherans. So I posed the question I'm super curious about, because since the 80s, I've been tracking the kind of influence of religion on science and then politics, the moral majority, and money in politics, and Jerry Falwell Sr., who maybe was not as weird as his son turns out to be. Anyway, it's
who thought you could ever say that?
I know, exactly. Right. Yes. I've been asking some of my sexologist friends, because I had no idea this was a thing where you sit in the corner of the room and watch your wife have sex with the pool boy. What? Okay. Turns out, I guess that's a thing for some guys. I don't know what it is, but anyway. But my point was that, even though I disagreed with a lot of the moral majority and the religious right's positions on stem cells and teaching creationism in science classes and so on, at least I respected the fact that they believed what they said. They were people of principle. And so I said, so why did 81% of white evangelicals vote for Trump? I mean, this guy is, by any standard, is not exactly a Christian or a religious or a moral man or a person of principles that you would direct your children to look up to. Look, here's our role model, and now he's president. Why'd you guys vote for him? And so the response I got was, he upholds and defends conservative values. We don't care what he does personally. He defends our values. Then, of course, conservative judges, the Supreme Court, which we're seeing unfold this week, and then, that we don't want to put into the presidency a role model. We don't care about role models. We want somebody that's going to get us the things we want in society that we agree with for our religion. And of course, they want to overturn Roe v. Wade and so on. And then the last one was God works in mysterious ways. He sometimes calls on really weird characters to deliver the message in the Bible. So maybe Trump is this kind of quirky, weird character that's not exactly morally upstanding, but he got us what we needed. Something like that. So
this is what I think. Yeah, Brett Stevens describes this as the people who see Trump as a low tool for high reasons.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I didn't know he put it that way.
Yeah.
But this was on the, and then the last point was, he says things that I'm thinking that I don't dare say at work. That is, he goes after the social justice warriors and Antifa, and he pushes back against identity politics. And most recently against this idea of corporations having sensitivity training. We're going to make all 700,000 Starbucks employees sit through this training program, even though 699,000 of them don't have a racist bone in their body. But we're going to make them sit through this. And none of them want to do it. They're all afraid to say anything. They'll lose their job. But Trump will stand up and go, no, this is wrong, and we're not going to do it. And a lot of people sitting back going, yes, okay, I like that.
So this is going to be a big problem for the right, particularly the Trump-supporting right, in the a period to come. I mean, whatever way the election goes, there is this problem, which is that a lot of people will admire the president for taking the stand against these things, for saying that he's going to ban critical race theory from government, and then I think wider afield. But the question that always comes up then is, has he actually done it? Is he actually doing it? Is he going to be able to do it? And the problem I think we're all going to be in there is this: if Trump doesn't manage to do that and do it properly and well, then everyone will get the downsides of his, in that. Oh, have we lost?
I think we're okay.
Have I lost? Oh, okay, sorry. and the downsides are obvious. The downside is you pay the price for you pay the political price for doing that, without any of the benefits of it. So, and this seems to me for the president's supporters to be one of the central problems. They will rile up their opponents for sure. They may score an ideological hit, okay, but what if they don't even manage to do it? And that seems to me to be one of the most important, as it were, conservative critiques of Trump, which is that he's able to make the sort of claims, he's able occasionally to make the right stance, but does he have any ability to see it through? A more adept administration might, for instance, do that quietly without the fanfare. Just make it clear that publicly funded institutions, for instance, aren't allowed to ideologically vet or retrain or reprogram all of their employees. But yes, the people who say, the president is not the person I would choose to do it, but I'm going to admire and use him for this thing that I want doing. Better be sure he does actually do that thing. And right. I wouldn't have the confidence that some of these people amazingly do have, because it has not historically been the case that the president has followed through on every promise he's issued.
Well, that's
to put it at its mildest.
Right. Yes, a tweet does not equal public policy change.
That's right. That's right.
Although it is entertaining.
Well, yeah, sure.
So what are your predictions for November 3rd and after? And do you think it's possible we could have that sort of a social breakdown if there's no decision made in, say, 2 months and we get into January? And
yes, I'm very concerned for this country. I think that I have no special insight. I have the same questions we all do have at this moment. The polls look fairly clear. Then your brain kicks in and it says, well, yeah, the polls looked clear 4 years ago.
Right.
But then there are, I suppose, competing thoughts I have. I saw a pro-Trump rally the other day in LA, and I would have said, actually, of the cars that passed and beeped support, about every other car beeped support for the rally. I was rather surprised with that in the heart of LA.
Yeah.
I do speak to people across have spoken to people since traveling in the States this month. I've spoken to people from quite a bewildering array of backgrounds who tell me that they are treating themselves, as it were, to a Trump vote. That nobody knows that's how they're going to vote, but that is how they are voting or have voted already.
Right.
That makes me think, okay, there's a possibility of an upset. And then I think there's this very plausible argument that Peggy Noonan has most recently made on the Wall Street Journal, very brilliantly as ever, last week, saying, America wants to get back to normal, and it will see Biden-Harris as normal. I think Peggy Noonan said, that America feels like it's stuck watching a reality TV show and can't change the channel. And particularly with the COVID episode the other week, and just the drama of it, just the endless, and that it may want to change the channel. And I think feels to me like quite a reasonable, a very, very reasonable analysis of the situation. And then I suppose there is this other thing which is on my mind, which is, like all of us, we're thinking, what happens if the vote just isn't clear? And I suppose in those scenarios, which seem very, eminently plausible, the one that would be worst would be, obviously, I think if the Democrats win, if Biden wins, I don't think there's rioting. I don't think there's civil disobedience. I think the rioting and civil disobedience really only occurs if Trump wins. And the way in which it most clearly will occur is if it is, first of all, thought to be the case that the Democrats have won, and then it turns out Trump has actually got it. I mean, it would be the thing. I think of it as being like the other year when the Oscars, the black gay movie Moonlight was the best picture Oscar was given to La La Land. And
Right.
then they realized actually that was the wrong one. It
Whoops.
was meant to go to the black gay movie.
Right.
And I remember watching that, and I don't know if anyone else felt this, but I sort of thought, oh, thank God it was that way around.
Right.
Because if the Oscar had been seized from the hands of the
God.
black gay film and given to the boring whitey La La film,
Right.
I sort of thought there'd been rioting breaking out that evening, and that was just on the Oscars. The political equivalent of that is the Democrats thinking they've got it, only for it to be torn from their hands and actually legitimately handed to Trump. That seems to me to be the nightmare scenario.
Especially if that happened through the Supreme Court, and because he had just appointed another conservative judge. Yeah. Oh boy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But, I'm old enough to have lived through 1968 through 72. So we had, the assassinations of King and Bobby Kennedy, and then the crazy election and Nixon, then Watergate and Vietnam. And yet, you look back on that and you go, yep, that was pretty crazy. But then things kind of settled back down with Ford and Carter. And then we had Reagan and then Bush. And, here we go. And everything is going to be fine. That's possible. But on the other hand, sometimes countries do fall apart. No one saw the USSR falling apart. And even the Soviet expert watchers were surprised.
That's right. I mean, I agree. I mean, I was speaking to a friend the other night on the East Coast who has lived through a lot, seen a lot, and was rather coolly sanguine about the whole thing. He cited 68 and said, that was worse than this. And so I'd like to think that's true. I'd like to think that that the hysterical attitude has merely embedded itself as a sort of performance art in our era. But I worry.
Yes,
I worry that there is something else going on.
Yeah, exactly. And it's hard to read individual stories. Portland and Seattle have been pretty crazy. Pulling down those statues of Grant and Lincoln is insane. Breaking Starbucks windows and all that, burning mattresses. The right just eats that up. If you watch Fox News, you think, every city in America is like this. And of course it's not, but it's pretty bad. And then you had the knuckleheads in Michigan that were going to kidnap the governor and hold her trial and then execute her. And I don't know what they thought they were going to do. And, start a new civil war, on the right. There's enough of that craziness that, we should be concerned. But on the other hand, you don't really see much of that very often. It's rare enough. But of course, that's the media's job to cover those stories.
Yeah. No, I think Americans and friends of America are right to be fearful at this juncture in her history. I think that it is going to be incumbent on everyone from all political sides to spend the coming period trying to shore up faith in institutions. But that can't just be done without the institutions earning that faith. A central conservative insight is the fact that people are loyal to institutions that are loyal to them. If any public body, the police are seen not to be deserving of the respect of the population, then the population will not show respect to the police.
Right.
If the IRS is not seen as being something which reflects back virtue to the public, then the public will not regard it as being a virtuous entity, and so on and so forth. I think an enormous amount has to be done in America to shore this up. Obviously, a lot of people, for political purposes and some for entertainment reasons, want to exacerbate those divides. And I just hope that perhaps 2020 has, among other things, shown those people a little glimpse of what that means in reality. In other words, when the performance becomes real. And maybe that will happen. But anyhow, this is a hell of a time to be in America, and I wouldn't miss this show for all the world.
No, for sure. I can't wait to read what you have to say about it, especially after November 3rd. Give us your thoughts on COVID-19 and what we should have done either in the UK or here. Was Sweden the right move? Keep the economy open and get through the darkest period and then recover, and or is that not a good model because it's too small and homogeneous to compare to a more diverse society?
Right. It's tricky. I'm not an expert in pandemics. I've been very reticent about it all because I tend to try to stick to talking about things I know about And like 99.9% of the population, I hadn't thought in any depth about pandemics until this year.
Yeah.
I suppose my layman's analysis is that the virus long ago became clearly not the thing we were fearful it was at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
That it's bad. It's obviously worse than the flu. People who claim it's just the flu are clearly exaggerating for their own purposes. But it's not the flu, and it's not the Black Death. And that second part has not been accepted by large chunks of, I think, people in authority, because I think it's been clear for some time that we've been in the midst of an overreaction. Or to put it in another way, we clearly did a lot of things that were necessary to protect the health services in our respective countries and to stop there being an overwhelming of the hospitals. But once that was averted, what we have been doing since has been in large part mad. I mean, my own view is that, one lockdown proved certain things. Mm-hmm. A second lockdown is impossible.
Yeah.
And it's impossible primarily because by now we should recognize that the economy isn't just a small factor within the mix, but the seriously competing virtue we need to be discussing in contradistinction to the whole issue of how you limit the spread of the pandemic. And I'm deeply worried that what we are involving ourselves in now is an act of supreme self-harm. I'm not at all sanguine about it. I think that the people who have underlying health conditions are particularly vulnerable to the virus need to be protected. But a society cannot go on in a situation in which whole industries just go to the wall,
right?
And we have to get a better view on this. I think we have to all become acquainted with the principle of risk. I think we all have to work out what level of risk we're willing to accept, and I think that it is incumbent upon all of us to start to push our authorities to allow the public to take what we see as being legitimate risks.
Yeah,
I'm willing to do that. I know not everyone is. I know a lot of people personally who are not willing to take those risks. But a society cannot function on the making of a virtue of an aspiration to zero risk. And I've just add one other thing, which is that what worries me now, it's been clear to me for a little while now, is that since we've now got a better understanding of what the virus isn't, we have basically spent our reserves to defend ourselves against a not that dangerous virus.
Yeah.
I mean, it's bad, obviously. I don't need to go over the death tolls in all of our countries, but it's not the plague. And if there were a plague now, we have no reserves to deal with.
Right.
We shot our whole thing on this.
Yeah, your compatriot Matt Ridley had the cover story on the Saturday's Wall Street Journal Review on it was a really thoughtful piece, basically on how science works or it doesn't work. That is to say, it's rarely that clean and simple. You run the experiment, you get the data, you draw the conclusion, you base the public policy on that. Most science is way more complicated, and when you get into the medical sciences, it's orders of magnitude more complex. These viruses are really small. They're really hard to get your mind around about their origins, and so he kind of rifled through all the different theories that have been put forth, and people of goodwill that are not trying to politically spin doctor the conclusions still have a hard time drawing the conclusions. Or it turns out they were wrong 6 straight times, but maybe the 7th time they finally got it right, and that's not unusual in science. And the whole thing is designed to get around all these cognitive biases and publisher perish and journal biases against replication studies. They want original studies, and this led to the replication crisis. And he went on and on about it. All true, and it's come to light because now the consequences are deadly. And so you kind of end up feeling sorry for people like, say, your man Boris, trying to do the right thing and find the right balance. And in a way, he has to kind of err on the side of the precautionary principle, just in case we better shut things down. Because what if it turns out, 30% of Great Britain dies? Then, that's on me. We can't have that. And therefore you go in the other direction. But then it turns out it's not so bad. Then what do you do?
That's right. That's right. Well, all of our politicians have been through a very sharp learning curve. And I think one of the regrets is that they hadn't been through this before. When it transpired that, for instance, the Imperial College in the UK graphs were so wildly off,
right.
And that the same people who did them came along with the same graphs, for instance, at the time of the BSE crisis, highlights something which, when this is all done, will really require a lot of thought, and I think a lot of something more. I mean, I am amazed that people with a reputation, a back catalogue this off, should ever have been able to dictate a public policy which ended up locking up the entire population not once but twice in a year.
Right.
And there ought to be a lot of judgment after this.
Someone pointed, it might have been Matt, that AIDS had a 100% fatality rate for a while, and we still don't have a vaccine for it. And yet, life goes on, and so it's just so hard to predict.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose my main thought on it all is that I just worry deeply, and have done from the beginning, that all of this is a prelude to something, not the main event.
Okay. I guess we'll find out in 2021 or maybe 2030 when we look back.
It's a bleak note to end on, but I do fear that.
Well, I thought you put it quite well, and of course, we're always glad to have your voice over here on this side of the pond to get some perspective on American culture from somebody as wise as you. So I appreciate you coming on. Good luck with, I know you have a bunch of other interviews you're doing with the paperback edition of The Madness in Crowds. I love that book. And let's keep pushing back and try to do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a great pleasure, Michael, and all the best to you and all your viewers. And